The house was too quiet now. The laughter of children, the hurried footsteps of a busy life, the constant ringing of the phone, gone. Margaret sat by the window, watching the world move on without her. At 78, she had outlived her husband, seen her children start their own families, and said goodbye to friends she once thought would be around forever. At first, the silence felt unbearable, like a weight pressing on her chest. But as the days stretched on, Margaret realized something profound. Solitude wasn't loneliness. It was an invitation to rediscover herself, to embrace the joy in small moments, and to let go of the past without fear. Margaret's journey into solitude began with resistance. She clung to memories, replaying them like an old film reel, afraid that letting go meant forgetting. But one morning, as she watched the golden sunrise spill across her garden, she decided, if life was offering her solitude, she would make it beautiful. She started with small changes, long morning walks where she greeted the wind like an old friend, journaling about the things she was grateful for, and allowing herself to dance to the old records she once shared with her husband. Instead of mourning the empty house, she filled it with music, books, and the scent of fresh lavender from her garden. One day, at the local cafe, she struck up a conversation with a younger woman who was also alone, sipping coffee while staring into the distance. They spoke about life, about love lost and found, about the fear of endings and the beauty of beginnings. It was then that Margaret realized, solitude didn't mean disconnection. It meant choosing when and how to connect, with people, with nature, with herself. She joined a poetry group, started painting again, and even learned to send voice messages to her grandchildren. Instead of resisting the inevitable changes of old age, she embraced them. She let go, not of love, not of memories, but of the fear of moving forward. Letting go in old age isn't about giving up, it's about making space. Space for peace, for new experiences, for finding joy in one's own company. Margaret's life didn't shrink in solitude, it expanded. And as she sat by her window, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility, full of peace, full of the quiet kind of joy that only comes when we learn to truly embrace ourselves. The days stretched into weeks, and Margaret found herself adjusting to her new rhythm. She woke up without the ache of longing for what was gone and instead welcomed the morning with curiosity. She learned to enjoy the silence, not as an absence, but as a space to fill with intention. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she strolled through the park, she saw a group of elderly women sitting on a bench, laughing over something on a phone screen. Their joy was infectious, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt a pull, not just to observe life but to be part of it. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward them. "Mind if I join you?" she asked with a warm smile. The women welcomed her instantly. They introduced themselves: Ruth, a retired school teacher, Evelyn, a former nurse, and Joy, a widowed artist. They met every Wednesday for coffee, gossip, and, Margaret was surprised to learn, TikTok videos. "You have to keep up with the times, dear," Joy said, winking as she showed Margaret a video of herself dancing to an old swing song. "Just because we're old doesn't mean we're done living." Margaret laughed, a deep, genuine laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. From that day on, Wednesdays became sacred. They met at the cafe, swapped stories, and even dared each other into small adventures, trying a new pastry, riding the carousel in the park, or taking an art class together. Margaret also rekindled her love for painting. With each brushstroke, she realized she wasn't just filling a canvas, she was filling the spaces in her heart. One afternoon, as she sat in her sunlit studio, painting the view from her window, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Daniel, her next-door neighbor, a retired musician in his early 80s. They had exchanged polite greetings over the years, but never much more. He held up a small box. "I baked too many scones," he said sheepishly. "Thought you might like some." Margaret welcomed him in, and over tea and scones, they talked about music, about their younger days, about how life often surprises you when you least expect it. As winter approached, Margaret realized something profound. She hadn't lost herself in solitude. She had found herself in it. Letting go of the past hadn't erased her memories. It had allowed her to make room for new ones. One evening, as she sat by the fire, a letter from her granddaughter arrived. It read, "Grandma, I used to worry about you being alone, but now I see you're not just living, you're thriving. You inspire me. I hope I'm as brave as you when I grow older." Margaret smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She had spent so much time fearing loneliness, not realizing that solitude could be a gift, a chance to reinvent, to reconnect, and to rediscover joy in unexpected places. And so, as the snow fell gently outside her window, she picked up her paintbrush, turned on an old jazz record, and let herself be carried away, not by the past, not by regrets, but by the beauty of the present moment. The winter months brought a quiet kind of beauty. Margaret's once empty home was now alive with color. Canvases leaned against the walls, each painting capturing a moment, a feeling, a memory. Some depicted the golden hues of autumn in the park, others the delicate pink of sunrise over her garden. Each brushstroke felt like a whisper from her soul, a conversation between her past and present. Her Wednesdays with Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy continued, their friendship deepening over shared secrets and inside jokes. They called themselves the Silver Sisters, a name that started as a joke but stuck. One day, Joy proposed something unexpected. "Let's take a trip," she said, eyes twinkling. Margaret hesitated. Travel had once been a part of her life, road trips with her late husband, family vacations with the children. But that was another lifetime. Could she still do it? "Where would we go?" Margaret asked, intrigued despite herself. "Somewhere we've never been," Evelyn said. "A new adventure, just for us." A month later, Margaret found herself standing in a sun-drenched Italian piazza, the scent of fresh espresso filling the air. She had said yes. The Silver Sisters had packed their bags and flown to Rome, determined to prove that adventure didn't have an expiration date. They wandered through cobbled streets, marveled at ancient ruins, and indulged in long, laughter-filled dinners with glasses of rich red wine. Margaret found herself sketching again, capturing the life around her, the street musicians, the lovers on a park bench, the warm glow of the city at dusk. One evening, as she sat on a quiet balcony overlooking the city, she thought of her husband. She could almost hear his voice, "Keep living, Margaret. Keep finding the magic." And she was. Back home, life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Margaret continued painting, meeting her friends, and embracing each day with open arms. And then, there was Daniel. What began as occasional tea and scones turned into something deeper. He played the piano while she painted, their creative worlds blending in a way that felt effortless. They shared stories of their youth, their regrets, their joys. One evening, as they sat on Margaret's porch watching the sunset, he reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted softly. Margaret squeezed his fingers. "Neither did I." She had spent so much time fearing what she had lost, not realizing that life had been waiting to offer her something new. As spring arrived, Margaret looked around her life with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had learned to let go, not just of the past, but of fear, of doubt, of the belief that joy had an age limit. She wasn't just surviving. She was living. And as she stood in her garden, breathing in the scent of blooming lavender, she knew this was only the beginning. Spring painted Margaret's garden in hues of lavender, daisies, and roses, mirroring the vibrant shift within her heart. She and Daniel had settled into an unspoken rhythm, afternoon strolls, shared dinners, quiet moments where words weren't needed. It wasn't the all-consuming love of her youth, but something gentler, steadier, like the warmth of the sun on a crisp morning. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, Daniel pulled out an old notebook. "I used to write songs," he said, flipping through pages filled with lyrics and melodies scribbled in faded ink. "But I stopped after my wife passed. Couldn't find the music anymore." Margaret understood that feeling all too well. She reached over, tracing a line of lyrics with her fingers. "Then maybe it's time to start again," she said softly. Margaret's own art had taken on new life. Encouraged by her friends and Daniel, she decided to display her paintings at a small local gallery. The idea of sharing her work, of allowing others to see the world through her eyes, thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. At the gallery opening, she was overwhelmed by the response. People admired her paintings, lingered over them, and asked about the stories behind each piece. A young woman approached her, eyes bright with emotion. "Your painting of the empty chair in the garden, it reminds me of my grandmother's house," she said. It's like you painted a piece of my heart. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had spent so much time thinking her best years were behind her, but here she was, still touching lives, still creating beauty. Summer arrived, bringing golden afternoons and lazy evenings on the porch. One night, as they watched fireflies dance in the fading light, Daniel cleared his throat. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady but nervous. "I know we're not 20 anymore, and I know we've both had great loves in our past. But I also know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I want is to see you. And when I fall asleep at night, I want to know you're near. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, would you consider marrying an old fool like me?" Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. She had believed love, in that sense, was something she had already lived through, something to be cherished in memory. But here was Daniel, offering her a future, not just companionship, but a new chapter. She smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "You're not an old fool, Daniel," she whispered. "You're a man who still believes in love. And so do I." Their wedding was simple, an intimate gathering beneath the great willow tree in Margaret's garden. Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy stood by her side, tears in their eyes as she walked toward Daniel. Her granddaughter, the one who had once worried about her being alone, clutched her hand and whispered, "You look so happy, Grandma." The ceremony was filled with laughter, music, and stories of love that never fades, only changes shape. Daniel played a song he had written for her, his fingers gliding over the piano keys as he sang. "Love is not a fire that burns and fades. It's the warmth that lingers in the shade. And when the years stretch long and wide, I'll still be standing by your side." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. She had spent so much of her life fearing endings. But now, she knew, some endings were simply new beginnings in disguise. And as she danced with Daniel under the stars, surrounded by love, laughter, and the whisper of the willow tree, she realized she had never truly been alone. She had always been surrounded by love, sometimes in the past, sometimes in solitude, and now, in the beautiful, unexpected joy of the present. And that, she thought, was more than enough. The days after the wedding felt like something out of a dream. Margaret and Daniel settled into their shared life with an ease that surprised them both. Mornings were spent sipping coffee on the porch, watching the world wake up. Afternoons were filled with music and painting, their creative spirits intertwining like old vines finally given space to grow together. Evenings were for storytelling, reminiscing about the past, but also dreaming about the future, because, as they both had learned, there was still so much ahead of them. Their love wasn't rushed or urgent. It was steady, like the rhythm of the seasons, comforting in its presence. Margaret had once feared that love was something she had already lived through, something she had to let go of in order to move forward. But now she understood, love was not a single chapter in life. It was the thread that wove through every moment, changing shape but never disappearing. The Silver Sisters' next adventure. Margaret's friendships remained just as important as ever. Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy, the Silver Sisters, had become her anchors, their laughter and companionship adding color to her life. One afternoon over tea, Joy clapped her hands together, mischief in her eyes. "I have an idea," she said. "That's dangerous," Ruth muttered, sipping her tea. Joy ignored her. "Let's plan a road trip. Just the four of us. One last grand adventure before we start acting our age." Margaret laughed. "Joy, we're nearly 80. I think we passed that threshold." "Exactly. That's why we need to do it now," Joy insisted. "Let's see the ocean, dance under the stars, maybe even ride a motorcycle." Evelyn chuckled. "I don't know about motorcycles, but I wouldn't mind feeling the ocean breeze one more time." Daniel encouraged Margaret to go. "We have our whole lives to spend together," he told her. "Go make more memories with your friends. I'll be here waiting." And so, they packed their bags, loaded into Joy's old, but surprisingly reliable, van, and set off toward the coast. The trip was everything they had hoped for. They drove along winding roads, windows down, singing to old songs on the radio. They stayed in charming little inns, ate far too much seafood, and told stories late into the night. One evening, as they stood barefoot in the sand, watching the waves crash against the shore, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had given her loss, grief, and solitude, but it had also given her friendship, adventure, and love. She had let go of the past, not by forgetting it, but by making room for the present. "I never thought we'd be here," Evelyn said, gazing at the horizon. Margaret smiled. "Neither did I. But I think that's the beauty of it." Joy raised a toast with her glass of wine. To life, messy, unpredictable, and absolutely worth living. When Margaret returned home, Daniel was waiting with fresh scones and a soft kiss on her forehead. "Did you have fun?" he asked. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "More than I ever imagined." Life continued in its quiet, beautiful way. Margaret painted. Daniel wrote music. They hosted dinners with friends, played with their grandchildren, and embraced every moment with open hearts. One day, as Margaret sat in her garden, watching the light filter through the willow tree, she realized something profound. Letting go wasn't about losing. It was about making space for love, for joy, for the unexpected gifts life still had to offer. And as Daniel called her inside for tea, she smiled, knowing that she had found exactly what she had been searching for all along: peace, love, and the quiet, steady joy of a life well lived. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm, a melody of quiet joys and simple pleasures. Margaret and Daniel embraced the ordinary, morning walks in the garden, the scent of fresh-baked bread filling the kitchen, the warmth of their hands intertwined during late-night conversations. Margaret's art continued to flourish. She began teaching small painting classes at the community center, encouraging others, especially those in their later years, to embrace creativity. She often told her students, "It's never too late to start again," and she meant it. Daniel, inspired by her passion, returned to music in a way he never thought possible. He started playing at local gatherings, sometimes even singing the songs he once kept locked away in a dusty notebook. Their home was always filled with sound, brushstrokes against canvas, the soft hum of a piano, the occasional laughter of grandchildren visiting on weekends. One day, Margaret received an invitation that surprised her. The gallery owner who had once displayed her work invited her to host a solo exhibition. "Your paintings tell a story," he said. "People should see it." For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was she too old for something like this? But then she thought of all the things she had once feared she couldn't do: find love again, take risks, embrace solitude. And yet, here she was, proving herself wrong time and time again. She said yes. The night of the exhibition, Margaret stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by paintings that told the story of her journey. There were pieces that reflected loneliness, the weight of grief, the longing for something more. But there were also paintings of light, golden sunsets, laughter captured in color, love woven into every brushstroke. Her children and grandchildren came, beaming with pride. Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy were there, raising their glasses in celebration. And Daniel, always her steady presence, stood by her side, his fingers laced with hers. A woman approached Margaret, her voice trembling. "Your painting of the willow tree, it reminds me of my childhood home. Looking at it feels like remembering something I didn't even know I had forgotten." Margaret smiled, deeply moved. "That's the magic of art, isn't it? It connects us in ways we never expect." The night was a success, but for Margaret, the true victory was in the realization that she had done something she once thought impossible. She had stepped into a new version of herself, one who embraced not just what was left behind, but all that was still ahead. As the years passed, Margaret and Daniel continued to grow together. Their love was not marked by grand gestures, but by the quiet, steady presence they offered one another. They celebrated birthdays, watched their grandchildren grow, and filled their home with laughter and music. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel took her hand. "Do you regret anything?" he asked. Margaret thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said. "Not anymore." She had let go of the past, not by forgetting, but by making space for the beauty of the present. She had embraced solitude, but in doing so, she had found companionship, adventure, and a love that had been waiting for her all along. And as she rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, listening to the hum of cicadas in the distance, she knew life had given her exactly what she needed, exactly when she was ready to receive it. And that was more than enough. Time moved gently, like the soft turning of pages in a well-loved book. Margaret and Daniel continued their days in the comfort of their home, filling each moment with quiet joys: morning tea in the garden, slow dances in the kitchen, evenings spent reminiscing about the past and dreaming about the future, however much of it remained. But as the seasons changed, so did life. One autumn afternoon, while trimming the lavender bushes, Daniel suddenly paused, gripping the wooden fence for balance. Margaret rushed to his side, concern flickering in her eyes. "I'm just a little dizzy," he assured her with a soft smile. "Must be the heat." But it wasn't just the heat. Over the next few weeks, the dizziness returned, along with fatigue and moments where he seemed lost in his own thoughts. A visit to the doctor confirmed what Margaret had feared. Daniel's heart was growing weaker. Margaret held his hand tightly as the doctor spoke, his words blurring into a distant hum. She had lived through loss before, but the thought of losing Daniel was a different kind of ache, one she wasn't sure she could bear. Despite the diagnosis, Daniel remained the same. He still played his piano, still cracked jokes with Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy, still looked at Margaret like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. But the reality of time pressed against them, making every moment feel more precious. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, Daniel reached for Margaret's hand. "I need you to promise me something," he said gently. Margaret's throat tightened. "Anything. When the time comes, don't stop living. Keep painting, keep laughing with your friends. Take another trip. Dance under the stars. Promise me you'll keep finding joy, even without me." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she nodded. "I promise," she whispered, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. Winter arrived, and with it, Daniel's strength waned. Margaret cared for him the way he had once cared for her, reading to him when his eyes grew too tired, playing his favorite jazz records, making sure he never felt alone. One evening, as snowflakes dusted the garden outside, Daniel sat at the piano, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. It was the song he had written for her, the one he played on their wedding day. Margaret stood beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Dance with me," he murmured. She helped him to his feet, and they swayed together in the dim glow of the firelight, the melody wrapping around them like a soft embrace. It was their last dance. In the days that followed Daniel's passing, the world felt unbearably quiet. The space beside Margaret in bed, the absence of music in the house, the missing warmth of his hand in hers, it was a silence she had known before, but this time, it felt different. And yet, she remembered her promise. She continued painting, channeling her grief into color and light. She surrounded herself with Ruth, Evelyn, and Joy, who refused to let her retreat into solitude. She traveled, visiting the places Daniel had once spoken of with wonder in his eyes. She lived, not just for herself, but for him. One evening, as she sat in her garden beneath the willow tree, her granddaughter came to sit beside her. "Grandma," she said softly, "do you miss him?" Margaret smiled, looking up at the sky, where the first stars of the evening had begun to appear. "Oh, my love," she whispered, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. "He's not gone. He's in the music, in the paintings, in every sunset and every note of laughter. Love like that, it never really leaves." And as the wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a familiar melody, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself simply be, grateful, fulfilled, and at peace.